It is 1520, and we are in France. Henry VIII is King of England at this time, and the King of France is Francis I. And Henry VIII, like many English kings, liked to think of himself as King of France. In 1510, Henry had joined the Anti-French League as the then King of France, Louis, had waged something of a war with not only the papacy, but with the Holy Roman Empire, and therefore when Henry saw an opening, he joined the Anti-French League and went in to conquer France. Only this was the new king of France, and this was a new day. And in 1520, we have a really extraordinary moment in history, where both the English and the French kings and all of their courts got together in something that is known as the Field of Cloth of Gold. And it was known as such because all of the tapestries and the tents and the festivities were draped with this elaborate and beautiful gold fabric. And the festivities were carried on for several days with the hope that England and France would embark on a new friendship, and that their friendship and their alliance might in some ways check the rising power and the incredible might of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. And the quest for friendship was really punctuated by a strange moment, at least by modern eyes, in which Henry and Francis end up in the middle of a ring having a wrestling match. Now, in this day, kings believed that they were strong, they believed that they had military prowess, and so when the two kings got together for a wrestling match, it was essentially a display of their individual strength. But no one could escape the fact that if either king got upset, that very often this could precipitate war. And in fact, by a few accounts, it very nearly did. Because during the wrestling match, Francis somehow managed to throw Henry, that is to say, toss him onto his back. And Henry, always the baby, went off and sulked in his tent. And though it is unlikely that Henry would have attacked France for this simple reason of his own embarrassment, nevertheless, the times were now tense, and the friendship was on rocky soil already from the very beginning. And so what ends up happening is Francis does a masterstroke politically. He enters into Henry's tent. He swears fealty to Henry, bowing down, offering his life and his kingdom to his new friend, Henry. And while this might seem to be a strange concept of political theater, two kings wrestling, and then one king sulking, and another king having to make restitution, what is going on behind this is a long-standing feud between the English and the French that goes back centuries, all the way back into the 11th century. And one of the most wide-ranging and important wars between England and France. Though there had been many, and though long after the 16th century there would continue to be wars between England and France all the way down until after the time of Napoleon, still, at this point, by the time of Henry, one of the most important wars had been fought and ended just a generation or two before Henry came to the throne. And that war was the 100 Years' War. And the 100 Years' War is staggeringly important for both England and France, not only for the churning of the tide between colossal powers in the later Middle Ages, but also for the rearrangement of the lands owned by England and by France, and for the future power and might of either kingdom in both the early modern period and on down until today. And so in this lecture, we're going to take a look at the 100 Years' War. We're going to examine exactly what happened that gave rise to this century-long conflict between England and France. And we're going to note the breakdown and the break-up of various English and French territories. And then we're going to look at the important figure of Joan of Arc. And we can begin by discussing the context of the 100 Years' War. Now, the 100 Years' War has always been a joke for historians because it was a war that was neither 100 years, nor was it one single war. It was rather a series of conflicts between England and France that lasted actually a bit over 100 years. But that being said, in the 19th century, historians writing about this period of time dubbed it the 100 Years' War, and that's what we've known it by ever since. But the conflict itself between England and France goes back all the way to 1066 with the Norman invasion or the Norman conquest of England by the Dukes of Normandy. And what happened after that conquest is you had a real kind of tense relationship between England and France. On the one hand, England was technically a vassal of the French king, at least in terms of his holdings of certain areas of France. So, for example, the King of England was the Duke of Aquitaine, that area down in southwest France that had been formerly held by the Carolingians. But what happened is over time, France lost certain regions to England, not through war per se, sometimes through war, sometimes just by takeovers of England, of wide areas of what we today call modern France. And so by the time of the beginning of the 100 Years' War, you had a strange relationship where the King of England technically, in his role over certain regions of France, was a vassal to the French king. And yet, in terms of power and influence, England had the upper hand. And ruling France during this time was a line of kings known as the Capetian kings. And the Capetian line had run all the way back to 987, all the way back to the 10th century. And the Capetian line has a storied history, all the way down even until today. In fact, the Grand Duke of Luxembourg today and the kings of Spain, in fact, descend from this Capetian line all the way down until today. But in 328, just several years before the outbreak of the 100 Years' War, the Capetian line dies out. There is no longer a direct heir from the Capetian line in France itself. And so whenever this happens in the Middle Ages and all the way through the history of monarchies, what happens is people break out the genealogies, and they start to look to see who has, as they say, the strongest claim to the throne. Now, there was a certain arithmetic to this, determining who had the strongest claim. And whenever a line died out like this, very often it was a bit of a toss-up sometimes between who had a strong claim and who had the strongest claim. And technically speaking, the current King of England, Edward III, had a pretty strong claim to the French throne. He was descended a good bit back all the way to the Capetian line, and technically he himself could have claimed the French throne for himself. Now, the French, of course, don't want this, and so they put forward another claimant, a man by the name of Philip of Valois. And Philip is proclaimed, and he is coronated Philip VI. Now, Edward III, by all accounts, seems to give up his right to the throne. He doesn't even seek to try to take the French throne. And this is certainly understandable. The King of England can't be expected to be both King of England and King of France at the exact same time. However, what precipitated the war, and what precipitated Edward III finally claiming the French throne for himself, at least by name, was the fact that over the period of time from roughly the Norman conquest and the height of the English claim over French territories, what has happened is England has lost territory in France all the way down until all that it has at this point is the area of Gascony. And just as Philip VI comes to the throne, what happens is Philip decides that Gascony should be part of the French territories. And so in 1337, Philip claims Gascony for himself, and he does so on the precedent that England and the English king have not been proper vassals to the French king, and therefore they have rescinded their rights over this last territory. And so in 1337, the 100 Years' War begins. And by and large, it really was not much of a contest. For much of the 100 Years' War, England wipes the floor with France. By most accounts, England has a superior armed force, and they have superior tactics. And for the first period of the war, from 1337 down until 1360, Edward takes a unique tactic for medieval warfare at this time, which is that Edward does not seek to have a series of pitched and bloody battles where all the forces come crashing together in one fell swoop and see who wins. What Edward does instead is he has a series of skirmish wars. He attacks, he retreats. He attacks, he retreats. And what he seeks to do by doing this is to demoralize the French and their desire to even wage war against the English. Edward also manages to create an alliance with Flanders. Stupid Flanders. And what he does is by partnering with the area of Flanders, Edward manages to have a home base there on the continent where he can launch a series of naval attacks on ports and where he has a quick strike location to most of the areas of France. And the two most important battles during this period are the Battle of Crécy and the Battle of Poitiers. And the Battle of Crécy was in 1346, and the Battle of Poitiers was in 1356. Both are major battles, and both are decisive routs for the English over the French. And so during this period of time, as England is winning decisive battles over the French, what happens is the locals end up rebelling. And so from 1357 to 1358, there is actually a series of peasant wars in the French countryside and around the city of Paris. The peasants are upset that France is losing, that it's losing decisively. And so in 1360, there is signed the Treaty of Brétigny, which was a treaty that was entirely lopsided, all in favor of the English, and very little was in favor of the French. And the French king was essentially forced to do this. The military losses and now the riots by the peasants were simply too much for the French king to endure. And the treaty again was very English favorable. That is to say, England was allowed to keep most of the lands that it had conquered, including the pivotal city of Calais. England no longer has to refer to itself as a French vassal. And more importantly, at the Battle of Poitiers, the English had managed to capture the French king. And with the treaty, they ransomed the king back to the French people for an enormous sum of money. And essentially, over a period of time, the only thing that the French managed to get back in return is that the English king would cease to call himself the heir to the French throne. So at this point, England has essentially won at least the most decisive parts of the beginning of the 100 Years' War. And as often happens in human history, the treaty, while verbose and grandiose in its desires to have both sides cease their fighting, in fact, England and France did not manage to call a full truce, and the hostilities for the next 9 years only continued to escalate. And so in 1369, the battle between England and France resumed. And on the side of England in 1413, there rose to the throne one of the most important English kings in all of English history. And that king was Henry V. The king so important and his legacy so large that he is enshrined in one of Shakespeare's most famous plays, named after him, the play Henry V. And Henry takes the fight to France. Henry takes on a different tactic, in fact, than Edward III. Rather than embarking on skirmishes, on hit-and-run campaigns, Henry V actually takes a systematic approach to the occupation of France. And perhaps the most important technological advance that occurs right about this time that actually gives England the victories is the adoption of the longbow. Now, the longbow's history is a bit shrouded in mystery. We think it was invented in the area of Wales, and that it was then subsequently adopted into the English army. But you recall in our lecture on knights and chivalry that the knight, the mounted knight, had both advantages and disadvantages. The principal advantage is that it was very difficult to beat a mounted man if you were a common foot soldier. He was higher than you, he had the value of the horse, he could slam into you. Often horses would be trained to kick and bite and do all kinds of things in war as well. And of course with the lance, a knight barreling down upon you, you on the ground on your own 2 feet, really didn't stand much of a chance. The only projectiles in war that were any potential advantage against a knight was both a short bow, a short stubby bow that would fire off a small arrow, had the unfortunate disadvantage of being unable really to pierce knightly armor, whether it was plate or chainmail. You just couldn't get enough velocity off of this thing. The crossbow had enough velocity, but the crossbow then was a really seriously cumbersome contraption. You could fire a bolt and you could have a certain amount of lethal impact if it struck true. The problem was it then took you any number of seconds, if not half a minute, to rearm the thing. Meanwhile, the knight is barreling down upon you. With the adoption of the longbow, however, into the English army, this advance essentially neutralized the speed and the power and the armor of the mounted knight. Not only that, but relatively speaking, compared to the knight, it was dirt cheap. Longbows could be fashioned out of all kinds of pieces of wood. All you needed was a long enough single piece that could be carved. You could get enough velocity out of the arrows, they could pierce all kinds of things, and as we've seen in innumerable movies, a volley of arrows could, from a very far distance, be rained down upon enemy lines from the back lines. And Henry V uses the longbow to bloody and bruise the French armies. He demoralizes them. There are arrows raining down. If the knights charge, they are easily picked off by these longbowmen. And essentially, for the first time in medieval history at least, your average foot soldier stood a chance against a mounted knight. And so Henry V systematically begins to occupy towns and major cities throughout France as he makes his way towards Paris and towards the heart of France. And there is a decisive battle in 1415, which is the Battle of Agincourt. And this battle is again won overwhelmingly by the English. And not only that, but because of the Battle of Agincourt and because of the defeat of the French, there is signed the Treaty of Troyes, in which the then king, Charles VI, actually names Henry V himself as the heir to the French throne. Now officially in the will, now officially according to the sitting French king, the heir apparent was the sitting English king, the reigning English king. Not only that, but Henry took the daughter of Charles for his wife, Catherine of Valois. Now, historians love to speculate what would have happened if Henry had lived long enough to realize this throne and take it for himself. But as it turns out, both Charles, King of France, and Henry V, King of England, both die in the same year of 1422. And because of that, the possibility that England would take France for itself was unrealized. Because back in England, Henry V's son, Henry VI, was at this time only 9 months old. And no matter how strong his claim would be to the French kingdom, the fact remains is that a boy of 9 months is not going to make a very good king, either of England, much less of England and France. Now, throughout the story of the 100 Years' War, we've been saying repeatedly that the English were essentially wiping the floor with France. So what turned the tide? Well, the answer to that question is not what turned the tide, but who turned the tide. Because into this quagmire steps Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc, all the way down until today, is a legendary figure for the French. Her role in ending the 100 Years' War, in salvaging France from near total annihilation in some senses, plus her colorful character as this cross-dressing peasant woman who put on men's armor and went off to war in an effort to beat the English, has a certain panache to it that has drawn people for centuries. But Joan of Arc was a real figure, despite all the legendary tales that are associated with her. We're not actually sure of her birth date. This was very common for peasants that didn't keep very good track of when they were born. And by the age of 13, apparently she began to hear voices. And she interpreted these voices as angelic voices, giving her pronouncements from on high as to what to do and how to conduct her life. And by the age of 16, Joan believes that these voices are encouraging her to go and see the Dauphin. And the Dauphin is the heir apparent to the French kingdom. And she goes and she visits him and she says, "I have heard from God, and he has told me to come to tell you to let me lead the French armies." Now, in many ways, it is a sign of how desperate the French kingdom is, that they actually cave in and allow this. The French king doesn't simply give her full control over the entire army, but he does allow her to go be sort of a figurehead over the army. And then he asks his noblemen to sort of keep an eye on this. And she goes out to the armies, and Joan stresses that if they are going to protect France, and if they are going to win the war, then they need to take 2 strategic cities, the city of Orléans and the city of Reims. And these 2 cities are very important because if you remember back to our lectures on the Merovingians and on the reign of Charlemagne, these cities have a historic past that goes all the way back to the Frankish kingdoms. Orléans was a powerhouse. It was where a significant number of dynasties based their power out of. And the city of Reims was all the way down until the French Revolution ended the French monarchy, the location where the French king was always coronated. And so to have 2 of your most important cities, one of whom is the place where your king is always coronated, in English hands, Joan realized was a demoralizing slap in the face. And the only modern equivalent for us would be, let's say that the city of Washington, D.C. was somehow taken over by an invading army. And while America itself still stood, and while the presidency was still intact, let's say the presidency had to move up to Connecticut and conduct its business up there. And so inaugurations no longer take place there in Washington, D.C., and there's no parades and there's no festivities. Well, you can imagine the demoralizing effect. It's sort of a sense of king of the hill, who's on top. And so Joan of Arc encourages and stresses and, in fact, really demands that the armies go after Orléans and Reims. And, surprisingly, the French armies are successful. They manage to take these regions back. And so Joan is a popular figure, particularly with the soldiers. There is just something about late medieval life, late medieval religion, that they believe that if someone has heard visions and now not only heard visions, but has brought success and victory to the French in a way that it had not before, suddenly the word of Joan of Arc was to be listened to. And what happens is as the 100 Years' War draws to a close, in the final decades, France claws its way back into taking over piece by piece by piece of areas that were formerly owned or recently taken over by the English. And at the end of it, by the end of the 100 Years' War, all of the victories and all of the successes of the English government were reduced simply to England holding really just two cities, the most important of which is Calais. And that city of Calais, within another 100 years, during the reign of Henry VIII, would itself be lost to France. Now, what happens to Joan of Arc? Some of you will know that she was burned at the stake, so how can this heroine, how could this victor of the French peoples be burned at the stake? Well, what happens is she is captured, not by the French, but by the Burgundians. And the Burgundians really saw themselves as sort of standoffish. They were a separate group from the French themselves. And so they captured Joan, and really what they believed is that they had the opportunity for a ransom on their hands. And so they offered to the French government, to the French king, the right to ransom her back for a certain price. But the French king realizes that if he ransoms Joan back, and that if she comes back to a certain amount of fanfare for her role in the French victories over the English, that the English king himself would actually be weakened as a result. And so the French king opts not to ransom Joan and instead passes. And so the Burgundians ransom Joan of Arc to the English. And in 1431, Joan is burned at the stake for being a witch. Now, she is called a witch because she has heard these voices, and it was known that she was being directed by some sort of spiritual force. Of course, she interpreted it as God, and her success in battle, she believed, was proof positive that it was God that was directing her. But of course, the English, having lost the battle, believed that she was a witch, and that the voices she was listening to were demonic. And so in 1431, Joan dies on the stake. And so just on the eve of the early modern period, just on the eve of the Reformation, the 100 Years' War leaves England and France essentially in the makeup that they would be for the remaining modern period. England no longer holds much of France at all. Again, they only hold the city of Calais, and even that they lose within the time of Henry VIII. And France, by contrast, now holds the vast majorities of the areas that were part of the Frankish kingdoms. They now have Aquitaine, Brittany, Gascony, and these areas as well. But there are a few other things that begin to arise at the end of the 100 Years' War, things that become more or less permanent, that shape the modern world. Perhaps the most important of which is that France now has a standing army. Now, a standing army is not a normal thing in the medieval period. Armies are expensive. With the feudal system, with the parceling of land amongst all of your lesser nobles, and allowing them to hold their own small armies, most medieval wars were fought by the summoning of feudal vassals and their small armies into a larger sort of checkerboard of different armies whenever you needed them. Now, of course, that has a problem of lack of discipline, lack of cohesion, these kinds of things. But the 100 Years' War, because it was more or less constant battle, forced France to enact a policy in which they eventually had more or less a standing army for a period of time. That in and of itself is one of the principal developments towards the modern world. Again, as we go into the early modern world, what we begin to see are some of these things that we take for granted, a standing army, for example. And we begin to see the kernel of these things begin to take shape. The other major thing that is going to arise in both England and in France is the constant problem of taxation. In the Middle Ages, it was only allowed for the king to tax for wars in very specific cases. For example, in England, the Parliament was really principally summoned by the king in order to effect taxation. he had to ask Parliament if it would be all right to levy a tax. And if they said no, at least in general, the answer was no. But with both England and France, what begins to happen is you see a more or less regular tax system at least attempt to come into existence by the kings. It's more successful in France. The French king more regularly will tax its citizens for the sake of armies and defense and for the standing army itself. In England, however, as the years wear on and as we get into the 16th century, what begins to happen is the king and Parliament don't always see eye to eye on the right of taxation. And if we look down the corridors of time, when we see the English Civil War, the principal spark for this was when Charles summoned Parliament to levy a tax to go and attack Scotland. And Parliament said no, and Charles said, "We'll be gone with you." And Parliament said, "No, we're not going anywhere." And before too much longer, they were at war. Well, some of the kernels of this are going to emerge just about the time of the 100 Years' War. England itself is going to have more trouble with this, but France is going to become more easily taxable. In the end, the 100 Years' War is something of a gateway between the late medieval period and the early modern period. Things that begin to emerge, tensions, kingdoms, land holdings, taxation, armies, these kinds of things. The reduction of the knight to not so much a superior force, but rather actually very much beatable with the longbow, begins to churn Europe into something more or less early modern. Now, it doesn't do this on its own, but again, it's kind of a gateway. It kind of signals a significant transition in time, so that by the time you get to 1453, which is the end of the 100 Years' War, is you begin to notice that England and France are essentially now in the early modern